thought we'd talk a bit about happiness. One way or the other, yeah. I thought we'd talk a bit about happiness today. Happiness in English is a multivalent term. It means a lot of different things. Similar to how the term love in English can mean anything ranging from a pleasant, super transitory experience, like I loved a movie, or I loved a song that you just randomly heard. And then love can also go all the way up to being the most intense and profound emotion, for instance, in relationship to divinity. I love God. And the same term love gets used for an entire range of positive emotions that people experience. In other languages, Greek, for instance, or Sanskrit for that matter, you'll get different terms that are used for love. In Greek, I think of agape versus eros versus philos. Philos is where you get words like philosophy from, which Sophia means wisdom. So philos, Sophia, love of wisdom. Agape is used in a spiritual, selfless sense, a religious sense, a spiritual sense, a transcendental sense. Eros is used almost exclusively in Greek in a sexual, romantic sense. And so this distinction between love, romantic, sexual love on one side, which could be very selfish, very exploitative, very self-absorbed, and then this incredibly transcendent, selfless, philanthropic, generous, magnanimous emotion of love on the other side. You're really crippled if you've only got one word for both of those incredibly distinct states of being. Do you guys follow that? You can do it. Contextually, you can do it. You have to look at the surrounding words of a sentence, and then you can figure out what the person speaking or the person writing is intended to convey. But those are two really different. You know, when McDonald's says, "I'm loving it," as part of their ad campaign, that's very different than a biblical statement or a statement in a spiritual text, "I love divinity. I love all mankind." One of them is trivial. The other one is profound. One of them is selfish. The other one is selfless. One of them is temporary. The other one is permanent. I mean, there's huge distinctions. And for that reason, many languages develop distinct terminology so that you don't have an uphill battle, and you don't need a ton of context, and you don't require to have a huge amount in common with the people you're talking about such that they understand what you're trying to convey, and you can, with some degree of exactitude, communicate to somebody else who's not already part of the choir of your life, so to speak, that they know where you're coming from. For this reason, language will evolve, and you'll have words like sympathy and empathy, vis-a-vis compassion, or love versus like, or love versus lust, calm versus prema in Sanskrit, desire versus love. Hey, don't sit like that. I can't see you. Yes, you, Mahabala. somehow it's somebody can sit right in between the two phones, and it's just totally disturbing. So, it's interesting, if you look at Buddhism and you look at core ideas of Buddhism, going back thousands of years to their sutta literature, which is their sutta in Pali. Pali is a layperson's form of Sanskrit. Sanskrit literally means properly or perfectly composed. And it's a term that means formal or exact. Prakrit is the other term used for language. Prakrit was the standard language which was spoken by people in general in India. There were different forms of Prakrit. And they have the same root words, the same verbal roots as Sanskrit, but it's a much simpler form. And Pali is the language of early Buddhism, and it derives from Prakrit. And so the word sutra, which means thread, and it's a Sanskrit term used to refer to very, very tight philosophical statements, literally would be translated best as aphorism. That's the exact English equivalent. A super concise term that packs a wallop. To be or not to be. I think, therefore I am. Those would be examples of English aphorisms. I think, therefore I am. It seems like a simple enough statement. I think, therefore I am. It's just 5 words. But that statement is pregnant. Cogito ergo sum. In Latin, it's even less. Cogito, I think. Ergo, therefore, sum, I am. It's even more concise. It's just 3 words. But it's philosophically, it packs a wallop, because if you're wondering whether or not you exist and what exists in the world and whether your life has any meaning or even whether it's all just a delusion, and if there's even any reality at all, if you're having these sort of nihilistic delusions, nihilistic inclinations, I would call them delusions. This statement also thinks they're delusional. But if you're having those sort of nihilistic thoughts and you're confronted with an existential crisis and you're thinking about whether or not anything really truly exists or not, this statement, I think, therefore I am, I'm doubting whether I exist, therefore I'm thinking about whether I exist, but in order to think about whether I exist, I must exist. Did you follow that? I'm doubting whether or not I exist. But in order to doubt whether or not I exist, I have to think, because doubting is a particular type of thought. Therefore, if you're doubting something, you're definitely thinking something. And if you're thinking something, well, guess what? Things that don't exist can't think, and therefore, your very thought about your existence is itself the proof of your existence. Self-evidently, incorrigibly, foundationally, and you can begin to build a philosophy of existence from that simple observation. Did you follow that? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It's a super simple statement. It's 3 words, but it's profound, and its profundity is almost best encapsulated by the use of minimum language. It makes it even more impactful because you can sit with it and memorize it and meditate on it and ruminate and great ideas. You want to almost marinate in them and just sit with them and allow them to seep into your consciousness and reframe the way you look at the world. they're time bombs. They're insidious. They work their way into your consciousness, and they do a number on you, almost like a virus. It's so simple, but then when it attaches itself to a host, that RNA, it turns into a whole thing. Anyway, so there's a term in Sanskrit for that. It means sutra. Sutra literally means thread. And so it's these thread-like verses that tie an entire philosophy together. Normally what happens is you would memorize a sutra. You memorize a sutra, or a number of sutras, like Vedanta Sutra is a famous Vedic text. Has 570 sutras, aphorisms. You memorize them. They're relatively easy to memorize. Atato Brahma Jigyasa, Jamadi Yasayata, Shastra Yoni Vat. You can memorize them. And then you read these incredibly detailed commentaries on the verses. And they tell you so much. Atato Brahma Jigyasa. Now, right now, inquire about Brahman. This is the Vedanta Sutra starts off with this. Now, right now, inquire about Brahman. The natural question you would have if you read this is what? Right? Now, right now, inquire about Brahman. Who or what is Brahman, right? That's a natural question. You got to define your terms. Socrates said this. First, define the terms. In fact, we're going to define happiness in just a moment. And so, the next verse defines Brahman. Jamadi yasya yataha. Jamadi yasya yataha. Brahman is that thing from which everything is born. Therefore, Brahman is the source of all existence. Brahman's God. That's right. Shastra Yonidvat, from the womb of Shastra. It's to be understood from the womb of Shastra. It's something that goes beyond what you would be able to figure out on your own through observation, through empiricism, and therefore you have to go to some higher source of knowledge. And in this case, the Shastra, the sacred text. That's the beginning verses of Vedanta. They're pregnant, they're powerful, they're thoughtful. It's interesting, but when you talk about going to a text, I mean, we go to a text when we want to do things like figure out the crime of murder. We look at legal codes, which are based on other legal codes. You got the state's legal codes, they're based on the Fed legal code, and the Fed legal code is based on the Constitution, which makes radical statements like we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equally and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. This is almost like a sutra. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Is it self-evident that all people are created equally? The answer is no. Look around. Everybody looks quite different. People are taller or shorter, fatter or thinner, stronger or weaker, smarter or less smart. You can break intelligence down into its, like a kind of a real intelligence, 8 distinct types of intelligence. And then you're going to find people score differently on each one of those. So when you look around, you see that people don't appear to be equal. In fact, the more you look, the more it seems like everybody's, just like your fingerprints are different, everybody's level of abilities are also different. But they make this bold statement: we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equally. And it's a powerful statement. It was written at a time when women didn't get the right to vote till 1919 in this country. So it was written at a time where women were not considered to be equal citizens. Hundreds of years before, 150 years before women even got the right to vote. You can think about the seriousness of your not being considered a full-fledged person. You're not allowed to vote although you were born in that country. It's a pretty serious denial of citizenship to say you can't vote in the country you were born in a democratic country which is founded on the right to vote and no taxation without representation, but yet you're not being represented by the people who fought a battle that there could be no taxation without representation, but then you could be taxed but you couldn't vote. But when the women's suffrage movement got started and they won the right to vote, they quoted the Constitution. Even worse than that, at the time the Constitution was written, there was slavery was in effect. And slavery wasn't popular in all the northern states, even at that time. The world had already begun to figure out that slavery was insane and criminal and unethical and indefensible. But our whole country was built on the back of slaves. The transatlantic slave trade and our ability to produce cotton and sugarcane was our country was built. I mean, imagine if you ran a business and your business was going in the red, and you could just stop paying your employees entirely and make them work for free. You'd have to be an awful business person to not be able to make money with free labor. And so the U.S. was able to rise up as a superpower because it was built from the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves. The same Constitution that allowed for slavery was eventually quoted in the construction of the 14th Amendment, which got rid of slavery. Even though it didn't hit right away. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equally. It didn't hit right away. The full impact of that statement wasn't immediately turned into law when it was written. But less than a century later, it resulted in the abolition of slavery. Less than a century and a half later, it resulted in the the establishment of women's right to vote. These statements, you get a good statement, a well-constructed statement, a thoughtful statement, it's pernicious. It works its way into your mind and affects you and helps you to grow and become better and doesn't let you remain complacent. Becomes a splinter in the mind's eye. And it's a catalyst for growth. Anyway, interestingly, one of the classic, the suttas are the sutras for the Buddhists. And so one of the classic suttas of the Buddhists is I want to say it's from the Mahaparinirvana Sutta, but I'm not 100% sure that's the text it's from. That might actually be a later text. But the classical form of the sutra is idam dukkha. Idam dukkha. This is suffering. Idam dukkha samudaya. This is the cause of suffering. Idam dukkha nirodha. This is the cessation of suffering. Idam dukkha nirodha gamini pratipad. This is the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. And so, this is suffering. What is suffering? Existence. Birth, death, old age, and disease. Living in this world is suffering. Idam dukkha samudaya. This is the cause of suffering. What's the cause of suffering? Tanha, thirst. Trishna, thirst. Kam, desire. Which also, in Sanskrit, the word kam means love, material love, and material desire. What causes suffering? Material desire, material love. Idam dukkha nirodha. The cessation of suffering is the extinguishment of your material desire, makes suffering go away. Therefore, Buddhism focused on detachment. Idam dukkha nirodha gamini pratipad. This is the path to end suffering. What's that path? It's the Have you guys heard the Four Noble Truths? This is the Four Noble Truths in Sanskrit, in Pali. These are the Four Noble Truths. And then the path to end the suffering is the Arya Ashtanga Marg, the Eightfold Noble Path. Right speech, right thought, right action, right work, etc. So, we've got a multivalent term like love. It can mean everything from you liked your French fries at McDonald's because you love them. I love McDonald's French fries. And it can also mean I love God. One of them is totally transient, temporary, and petty. The other one is profound and eternal. And one of them is selfish, the other one is selfless, but you can use the term love. Other languages have to separate love from lust, love from desire, eros from agape, from philos, calm from prem. An example of that is that the source of suffering in Buddhism is love, material love, which has its own word. So you don't confuse that the source of suffering is spiritual love. You know the source of suffering is material love because they have two different words. They can plug a word in. Otherwise you end up saying the source of all suffering is love, and you'd be totally vexed because in a sutta literature, without the context surrounding it, you wouldn't be able to make sense of it. Because they've taken the trouble to have two distinct terms, they can plug that right term in there and you immediately know what they're talking about. Happiness is another quagmire, polytheme, multivalent word that can mean a million different things. What is happiness? Yeah. I'm happy when, I don't know, I flip a coin and it comes up my way, heads. Flipping a coin with somebody, I'm happy. You're happy that you won a random game of chance. It's like there's nothing behind it. Mahabal, close the door for me a little bit. Thank you. Happiness can refer to just the most trivial of sensual pleasures that arouse you. You have arousal and valence. The experience of positive or negative emotion. There's standards of affect. The positive and negative emotions, and then the intensity of them. But the simplest of things can arouse you in a positive way, and you can feel happy. It's a nice temperature outside. It makes you happy. Then it was pleasant today. Then it gets cold at night, and now you're not happy anymore. You're sad. It can be that trivial. That's circumstantial. That environmental. But then you can also say, when I realize that God loves me, it makes me happy. When I realize the love of divinity, it makes me happy. That would be the most profound. Just like with love, it runs this gamut from the most trivial and material and selfish and sensual emotions all the way up to happiness where I sacrifice my life for a good cause and I die with a full heart and happy. Where there's no sensual pleasure. There's misery. You're suffering. It's painful. But you can describe that painful, torturous experience that results in your death, and you can say, I'm happy. Why? Because I died for a good cause. My heart was full. Again, just like with love, happiness runs the gamut. And lots of languages also have different words for spiritual and material happiness. For the same reason they have different words for spiritual and material love, because they really represent two distinct concepts. Similarly, lots of languages have different words for material and spiritual happiness, because they're really distinct ideas. In fact, even in happiness studies, if you look at gerontology, the study of aging, or you look at positive psychology, the study of what people do right instead of what people do wrong, instead of a pathology-based approach to psychology where you look at what people are doing wrong and try to mitigate it, you instead look for what people are doing right and you try to imitate it. That leads to things like happiness studies within the field of positive psychology, a burgeoning field. And so you get these happiness studies. A lot of times they'll actually make a distinction within happiness studies in English, that happiness can refer to your current state of feeling, how you feel right now in the moment. But then happiness can also refer to SJW, subjective well-being. SWB, subjective well-being. You can also refer to that. SJW, social justice warrior. SWB, subjective well-being. And subjective well-being is an overall approach to looking at your life and your values and what you stand for and who you are. And the subjective well-being, you can be miserable. It could be cold out. You could be hypothermic. You could be hungry. You could be exhausted. You could be in great physical duress. But you could answer the question, are you happy? You could answer yes to that question. Because if I look at my life as a whole, from a holistic viewpoint of who I am and what I stand for and what I'm about, I'm living in consonance with that and I'm happy. Even though temporarily at this moment I'm suffering. So like Nordic countries, they generally score pretty high on the subjective well-being profile. South American countries, they usually score really high on the current state of affairs well-being. And so you'll find that people in different countries may score differently on happiness studies depending on how you choose to define happiness, whether it is your current emotion right now, do you feel good at the moment, or whether we're asking about, do you feel good about your life? I think we need to have another word. Happiness with a lowercase h, happiness with an uppercase h. We need to have this kind of language because without it, it's easy to get confused. Now, even without a separate term, even without doing a formal happiness study, I think there's value in us learning to look at our life in two distinct ways. And we need to learn to look at our life in terms of my current emotions. They're maybe here. They might go up and down inevitably with the rising and falling of the temperature, with success and failure in business, with ups and downs in terms of my health. But then we need to also have another category of happiness going on up here that supersedes hierarchically and is above this lower category, which is about my ultimate sense of purpose. Who am I? What do I stand for? How congruent is my life with my value system? And how happy am I with the life I'm leading? And I'm arguing that we should have two levels of happiness. And now we can read our verse. Nasti buddhir ayuktasya. Nasti buddhir ayuktasya. Ayukta. Yukta is the past participle of yoga. It is cognate to the English word yoke. When you yoke an animal to a harness, you are controlling that animal and focusing its efforts. You take a yoke, the physical object yoke, the noun yoke, and then you yoke the animal. You put the yoke on the animal, or you put the harness on the animal, to use a different word. You take the yoke and you yoke the animal. You could say that in English. I yoke the animal to the yoke would be a confusing but totally clean statement in English. Just like the statement, there is no there, is a super sophisticated editorial commentary that nonetheless is purposefully repetitive to make a point. You're yoked to the yoke. Makes perfect sense because yoke is both a noun as well as a verb. But to switch the word for easier comprehension, if you yoke an animal to a harness, that animal is now yoked. Yukta means yoked. Yuktasya means of the yoked. Ayuktasya, just like in English, theist, atheist, ayuktasya means of the unyoked, of those who are not disciplined, of those who are not self-controlled, of those who are materialistic and who just run around following their senses, who don't have any discipline. Nasti buddhir. There's no intelligence. You can think about it. For example, let's just think for a moment about HIV. HIV. HIV, when I was growing up, depending on your age, when you were growing up, or when you were an adult, But HIV used to be a death sentence. You got HIV, you would get AIDS, and within 2 or 3 years, you were going to die. And the most expensive drugs they had on the planet were little better than doing nothing. And everybody who got AIDS died. This was in the 80s, early 90s. And if you think about the spread of AIDS, and people knew about it, at least in this country, people knew about it. If you think about the spread of AIDS, AIDS is spread primarily in 2 ways. It's spread through intravenous drug use, and it's also spread through sexual contact. Now, if you take sexual assault off the table, which is a way to spread AIDS, but if you look at consensual sexual activity and voluntary intravenous drug use, just think for a moment. Is the pleasure of orgasm worth a death sentence? Also, that's not a philosophical question, because I'm not even talking about the pleasure of sex or orgasm in a general sense over the course of an organism's lifetime and the ability to procreate. I'm talking about just one instance, one time. Who would gamble their life for one orgasm? Why would that even be? Who would play that game of Russian roulette? Normally, if you want to get people to play Russian roulette, you offer them, $1 million or some $1 billion. $1 million is what it used to be. It'd have to be $10 million at this point to get people to pull that trigger. But who would risk that for something that trivial? Or, in contrast, with intravenous drug use, who would risk dying to share a needle for one injection of heroin, usually as a drug? It's insane, right? Who would do such a thing? But yet, so many people do that. Because if you become too materially enmeshed and enraptured, you become stupefied and you become almost like an animal operating on instinct who is incapable of deeper prefrontal cortex thought, deliberative thought, profound thought, far-reaching thought, broad thought. You stupefy yourself and you lose your intelligence such that you take gargantuan risks for the most trivial of pleasures. This is evidence for this point. For someone who lacks discipline, the lacking of discipline means you're a victim of your sensual desires, means you are led by your sensual desires, and it means that you have no intelligence because you don't have the ability to step back and deliberate. You're too enmeshed and tethered. It's interesting. By not being tethered to your values, you become tethered to your senses, and everything runs amok. And you take colossal risks for the most trivial of rewards. Nasti buddhir ayuktasya. Nacha ayuktasya bhavana. Nacha ayuktasya bhavana. And for those unyoked, there can be no concentration. There can be no meditation. There can be no focus. Bhavana in this context means focus. Thoughtfulness. Deliberation. Nasti buddhir ayuktasya nacha ayuktasya bhavana. For those who are unyoked, they have no intelligence. For those who are unyoked, they also have no ability to focus. Nacha abhavayata shantir. And for those who can't focus, there's no peace. And for those who can't focus, there's no peace. For those who aren't disciplined, they have no intelligence. For those who aren't disciplined, they can't focus. Because what are you going to focus? Your intelligence. You have no intelligence, you have nothing to focus. And so they can't focus. If you can't focus, you'll never find peace. And then here's the punchline. Na shantasya kuta sukham. And for those who aren't peaceful, where's happiness? And for those who aren't peaceful, how can there be happiness? It's a rhetorical question. Kuta is an interrogative. Where is the happiness? How can there be happiness? Nasti buddhi ayuktasya. If you're not disciplined, you have no intelligence because you're a victim of your senses and you're running around tethered to your senses. You're not tethered to something higher. Nacha ayuktasya bhavana. You can't focus. Nacha abhavayata shantir. And if you can't focus, there's no peace for you. You're always going to just be running around from one thing to another. And then, na shantasya kuta sukham. Ashantasya kuta sukham. And if you're not peaceful, where's happiness? One who's not connected to the Supreme can have neither transcendental intelligence nor a steady mind, without which there's no possibility of peace. And how can there be any happiness without peace? I think this verse is powerful and profound because it clearly delineates that there is a different type of happiness other than sensual pleasure. And in fact, the prerequisite of that higher form of happiness is peace. And the prerequisite for that peace is focus. And the prerequisite for that focus is discipline. And you move from a physically disciplined life to a mentally disciplined life. You move from behavioral therapy to cognitive therapy. That cognitive therapy is then, have these incredible ability to think as human beings. Our amygdala is small. Our prefrontal cortex and the layers of our prefrontal cortex are huge, unlike other animals. The encephalization of our brain is the stuff of legend. We are unique amongst all animals because of our incredible ability to think. As evidenced by our ability to speak in language and communicate with one another that animals cannot do. Not in a recursive way like we can. I'm going to the store with my friend on this day to buy this thing for this party, in this car, in this city, on this street, at this time. That stacking of one prepositional phrase on top of another recursively, where you make use of similar words to communicate more and more complex, unique thoughts. No animal can do that, but a 5-year-old can. We're built different. You discipline your body, you discipline your mind. A disciplined mind can then think deep and profound thoughts and fulfill our purpose as human beings and start to think about really far out stuff like subjective well-being vis-a-vis a current state of happiness, like sensual versus fundamental happiness, like selfish versus selfless love, like agape versus eros. And we can start to work through these concepts and grow and powerfully utilize language and thought to go to beautiful and profound and amazing places. And so what you've got here, thousands of years ago, is a similar concept that current positive psychologists have come up with, where you have to divide happiness into two different categories. And so Krishna regularly says you should be transcendental to material happiness and distress. But then he speaks about this type of spiritual happiness, which is built on peacefulness. I think this is cutting edge technology. I think it's cutting edge thought. We talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, yet both ideas are here in this ancient text. A behavioral model, which leads to a cognitive model, and then within that cognitive model, when you're thinking about stuff, that's where human beings can really springboard into transcendence and move from disciplined thoughts into something really profound, something translogical, something transcendental. I guess the one other thing I would mention is that I think when we talk about being disciplined, because that's an undefined term in this conversation, most of us understand what discipline means. You understand the ways in which you are not disciplined in your own life. You understand probably what you need to do to become more disciplined in your life. If there wasn't a bunch of people around, it was just two of us, and you trusted me, you could probably delineate for me perfectly the exact ways in which you're undisciplined in your life and what you need to work on. However, we're not having a one-on-one talk therapy session. We're having a class. And so I at least want to give something generic about discipline. I think a great place to start with discipline is to figure out what you value. What's important to you? To sit down and work out your value system. Just like the framers of the Constitution did. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That doesn't mean that all men are discernibly or obviously created equal. It means that we've decided that that's what we believe, and we're writing that down, and we're not going to entertain anything that does not accept that axiom as being axiomatic. An axiom is something that you temporarily accept as being hypothetically true in order to do your work, but an axiom can also refer to something that you've deliberated upon and decided is a foundational principle of reality. They've taken it axiomatically, and now they've said, this is our axiom, and for everybody else, forevermore, who reads this document, this is what they have to agree to. You need to think it through. What do you value? What's important to you? What's the most important to you? What's a life worth living? What would you be willing to die for? And even more importantly, what are you willing to live for? Once you arrive at that value system, and this, by the way, is called axiology, the study of values. Once you arrive at what you consider to be valuable, then have integrity. Integrity comes from the word integer. It means be whole. Being whole, in terms of integrity, means that you live your values. What your values are, you live according to them. If you live according to your values, whatever those values may be, you then have integrity. Without having the discipline of A, figuring out what you value, and then B, living in accord with your value system, you cannot be called yukta, disciplined or yoked. Yoked in this sense means yoked to what you believe in. Yoked to your value system. Now we can also sit down and decide what are universal values. Somebody could decide on a bunch of awful values and go and commit jihad and kill a bunch of people or torture a bunch of people and stand behind that. You could look at the Spanish Inquisition, where people thought that you would go to hell forever if you weren't a Christian. And so in the post-Muslim world in Spain, and the post-Jewish, post-Muslim world, there was a bunch of Jewish people in Spain, a bunch of Sephardic Jews living in Spain. And then the Muslims came in and took over for about 3-4 centuries, and Islam ruled Spain for 3 or 4 centuries. I don't know how familiar you guys are with Spanish history, but, right? You know this, right? She's from Spain, from España. And so, and then the Christians came in, and they had this idea that if you didn't accept Jesus, you were going to go to hell forever. And so one thing they would do is they would get people from other religions, also the pagans, and they would torture them and burn them at the stake, because they sincerely believed that if they burned you at the stake, maybe you would repent, and then you wouldn't have to go to hell. You might go to purgatory and be able to go to heaven. So they would cause you the pain of being burned alive or being drowned. But they had this idea that they were being compassionate because they were saving you from burning forever in a lake of fire. So those people had integrity. They had a value system, and they lived according to their value system. Problem is, they had a lousy value system that needed to be looked at, seriously looked at. You get this circular logic where it's like, if I'm going to drown you, and if you're a witch, you won't drown, in which case I'll burn you at stake. But if you drown, you're innocent, but then you're dead, and you die either way, and there's no way to win. They used to do this stuff over land disputes as well. They would just have the two people fight it out. And whoever won, that's whose land it was. So you'd say, that's my land. They'd say, no, it's my land. Okay, let's have a fight. And then the person who won the fight, that's who God must have thought the land belonged to. They're kind of pre-philosophical systems of law that existed in the world that were really problematic. Sometimes you find them even in the modern day. I mean, there used to be an idea that if you were in debt, you could pass on your debt to your children. And you had debtors' prisons, and you could put your children in prison for you. You could also have your children suffer lashings for you. If there was corporal punishment and you were going to be lashed, you could have your children go and get lashed for you. Or even better, you could have your servants go and get lashed for you. And so you could have your employees go and take those hits for you. I mean, you could just the insanity of this compared to just the most simple labor laws. It's insane. But you find that's the backbone of Christianity. That Jesus suffered on our behalf. He became the Lamb of God. He became the Paschal Lamb who was sacrificed in the Passover in the Jewish sacrificial rite. He was sacrificed to extirpate the sins of all mankind. And so through vicarious atonement, because somebody else bled for you, therefore it mitigated your debt. Also, Adam and Eve messed up, and therefore everybody else who ever came from them was also messed up. Another way in which sins were passed down through the generations. So we fixed our legal system hundreds of years ago to abolish this kind of stuff. So your parents couldn't saddle you with incalculable debt and send you to prison or ruin your life. But somehow or other, still some of these ideas exist within some of the major world traditions, religious traditions. But at least you could say that person had integrity. So you figure out what are good values, and then you live according to them. You have integrity, and then this verse about being yoked applies to you, because you don't just do whatever occurs to you in the moment. You have a higher principle you live by. And that tethering of yourself to a higher principle, whether it be the law or a constitution or a philosophical doctrine or a religious text, or your own natural value system that you've arrived at through thought and through experience. All these things tether you and qualify you, I think, as yukta, as yoked, which then empowers you to have intelligence and be able to think more deeply about things because you're not just running around following your senses. And furthermore, it then allows you to start to meditate more deeply on what's ultimately valuable, and you can start to bump the hump and use your incredible power of thought to transcend this world and go beyond thought. But that peacefulness, that tranquility, that integrity, and the deep sense of well-being that comes from that is a prerequisite for the ultimate search for that higher happiness, that high-level, capital H happiness, which really is so profound it deserves its own word in English. And in the meantime, we have to spend an hour talking about it to make the point. I think that's it. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Let's have a little kirtan.